Appreciate you being here. If you want to open up your Bibles with me to the book of Nehemiah, we're going to be here for our time together. Book of Nehemiah, as you're turning there, again, let me say thank you for being here. It's been a joy to worship with you this morning, a joy to see you. Thank you for those who are visiting with us. We want you to know you are our honored guest. We're glad to have you. If you have questions about what we've done so far this morning, feel free to ask us about that. Love to talk with you. Hope to get good to see all of you. It's good to see you, Big Ron. Great to see you. I also want to say thank you for all of the phone calls and the messages congratulating us on our new baby, Jackson. I had to throw him in here. It's been a lot to us. It's encouraged us in so many ways. So thank you for that. Thank you, Jesse, for putting the meal train together. All of you who have contributed to that. It's been a joy. It's been a joy to watch my children with my new child, how excited they are, how much they love him, how much they want to hold him. Although in the hospital, Nora looked at me, then she looked at Jackson, me again, said, "Dad, I think Jackson has more." Which is like, coming out of the womb with more hair than Dad. So that's where we are in life. That's all right. Everybody's doing well. Allie's doing well. Thank you for continuous encouragement. This morning, I want to talk to you about some things here in the book of Nehemiah. I know we've studied this book not too long ago, maybe 6 months to a year ago, somewhere around there. And as I've had time to kind of think about a lot of things, there's something in this book that I think is worthy of our attention. Remember anything about the book of Nehemiah? It's about rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. That is what Nehemiah sets out to do in this book. He is living under the Persian Empire. They are the world superpower of the day. And he serves as the king's cupbearer, which, if you remember anything about that, that was a really important job, a serious job, a dangerous job, where he was tasked with drinking the king's wine to make sure it wasn't poisoned. Like, I don't want that job. But he finds out in the course of time that the walls of Jerusalem are still destroyed. They have not been rebuilt. And so he prays to God about that. We'll look at that in a moment. But he also asked for compassion because he's going to ask the king to go back and start the reconstruction and the rebuilding process. And he does that. But as I was thinking about that concept, about the walls of Jerusalem, if you remember anything about walls in the ancient world, they were so extremely important to cities. It was a source of defense against the enemy, a source of protection. And if you didn't have a wall, it was almost a shameful thing not to have one in the ancient world. As I began to think about that, I think what we could do is look at the walls as a metaphor for our spirit. What walls were to Jerusalem, our life is before God. I want you to think about your spiritual life as a spiritual wall, as it were. I want to talk about that this morning, rebuilding our spiritual wall, rebuilding our spiritual life. I don't know if you feel like this. I'm sure we all do, but from time to time, there are things that we struggle with. Whether it be temptation, whether it be a specific sin, whether it be procrastination or discipline or self-discipline, compromise, whatever it may be, those things begin to chip away day by day at our spiritual walls, our spiritual life. And sometimes we look up and say, what has happened? Everything is in pieces. How do I go back and start the reconstruction process? Where do I begin to start rebuilding? And the fact is, even though Nehemiah and the people got the walls rebuilt in 52 days, ours is a lifelong rebuilding. We will never have it completed perfectly until we go to heaven. And so how do we do that? When we find our spiritual life, our spiritual walls in shambles, where do we begin? Well, that's what I want to look at this morning. There are four things that Nehemiah and the people do in this book that I think we can find spiritual application to our lives as we start the rebuilding process with our spirit. That's what we're going to look at this morning. The first thing is this: take inventory. That's the first thing that Nehemiah and the people did. They took inventory of what was wrong, what was destroyed, so that they can start the process. If by chance you went home this morning and you found your house something like that, hopefully that is not. What would your thought be? You wouldn't just go to your house and say, all right, I'll go through the front doors, everything is fine. You would say, there's some changes that need to be made here. You would begin to start taking inventory of everything that was wrong. Obviously, there's a huge tree in the side of your house. But you would start to think about, okay, what needs to be done from here? What's the extent of the damage? What are going to be the cost of the repairs? What tools will I need? More importantly, who am I going to hire to do this? And when it comes to the walls of Jerusalem, that is exactly what happens with Nehemiah and the people. They look at what's going on and say, what needs to be rebuilt? They take inventory. There are two things that Nehemiah does that I think we should be doing with our spiritual life as well. Number one, he prays. And number two, he prepares. So let's look at that together. Look at his prayer, chapter 1, verses 4 through 6. The first thing he does to take inventory is he prays. Nehemiah 1, verses 4. That with it says, when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. I said, I beseech you, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who preserves the covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keep his commandments. Let your ear now be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer of your servant, which I am praying before you now, day and night on behalf of the sons of Israel, your servants, confessing the sins of the sons of Israel which we have sinned against you. I and my father's house have sinned. Let's stop there. I want you to see that first and foremost, Nehemiah says if anything is going to be done about their walls, it has to start with God. He comes pouring out his heart before God, saying, Lord, we need your wisdom. We need your insight. We need your help. If the walls are going to be rebuilt, if we're going to do this as your people, we need you. We need your help. He petitions God for his mercy and his wisdom, and he knows if anything's going to happen, it's because God is with him. He asks for God to open up his eyes to see what they need to rebuild, how to go about doing that. He understands how dire this situation is and knows God is the one who has to make it happen. And I would suggest for us, when it comes to our spiritual life, as we look at our lives and say, things aren't right, things are broken down, things are wrong, things are messed up, the rebuilding process has to start on our. Where we come before the God of heaven and say, Lord, things are messed up. God, we need your wisdom. We need your insight. My life is a wreck. My life is a mess. Without you, I can't. God was the foundation. And that's what I want you to see first and foremost before anything else we talk about. God, we are hopeless. It is only through him that our life, our spiritual life, can be rebuilt. We can do all of the application, but without him, we're nothing. Prayer allows us to see things as God sees. Prayer allows us to open up our eyes, our ears, and our hearts to what is broken and damaged. Ask God to help. It allows us to stop long enough to assess our spiritual life, where we should be before. That's the first step, pray. But Nehemiah doesn't just pray. He prepares. He takes action. And I think sometimes that is the hardest part, isn't it? We can look at our life and we can say, Lord, I need your help to make things right and to rebuild and reconstruct. It's another thing to actually take action. We see that in Nehemiah chapter 2. Go over to Nehemiah chapter 2. Read with me verses 11 through 16. Nehemiah chapter 2, verses. I want you to notice how Nehemiah acts, prepares, as they take inventory. It says, "So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days, and I arose in the night, and I and a few men with me. I did not tell anyone what my God was putting into my mind to do for Jerusalem, and there was no animal with me except the animal on which I was riding. So I went out at night by the valley gate in the direction of the Dragon's Well and on to the refuse gate, inspecting the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and its gates which were consumed by fire. Then I passed on to the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was no place for my mount. So I went up and by night by the ravine and inspected the wall. And then I entered the valley gate again, and officials did not know where I had gone or what I had done, nor had I yet told the Jewish officials." You see what Nehemiah does in this section? He prays, but he also begins to survey the damage of what needs to be fixed and replaced. The text tells us he goes out at night, maybe to conceal what he's doing from the enemy, but more importantly, to formulate a plan. Say, here's what needs to be replaced. That's what godly leaders do. They have a plan in mind before they speak it to the people. And that's what Nehemiah does in this section, because he knows if he's going to get the people to rise up and build, he has to have a plan. So he goes around from place to place, inspecting the walls to see what needs to be fixed. Do we do that with our spirit? Is that not one of the hardest things to do? To look with humility and self-introspection to say, things aren't right. It takes courage. It takes humility. It takes praying before God to say, help me to see what needs to be fixed. If you're anything like me, sometimes it is easy to put those broken down parts of my spirit. I'll get to, but it's hard. But it's absolutely critical to see where we need change. Sometimes we might be overwhelmed and discouraged, thinking, where do I begin? Can I even do this? We begin to let self-doubt get into our hearts and our minds. But in those moments, we have to remember what Nehemiah's response was and what ours should be, that God will help us. If God is with us, what seems impossible to be, not impossible. And so take inventory. That's the first thing that Nehemiah does when it comes to rebuilding our spiritual lives. We have to take it. Number two, I want you to see that another thing we can do with our spiritual life is make the rebuilding process a priority. Look at chapter 2, verses 17 and 18. This is after Nehemiah does all of the inventory. Notice what happens in 18. He now comes to the people and says, we need to make this. Verse 17, then I said to them, you see the bad situation we are in, that Jerusalem is desolate and its gates burned by fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem so that we will no longer be a reproach. I told them how the hand of my God had been favorable to me, and also about the king. And they said, let us arise. And so they put their hand. I want you to see that they made the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem a priority. It was important to them. It was urgent to them. Nehemiah is this incredible leader who stirs up the people and says, God has been with me. God has shown favor to me. So let's start the rebuilding process. And they say, let us arise. I was reading through that text this week. There was one word that kept popping out to me. That was the word resolve. They had a resolve. That word literally means to decide firmly on a course of action. They weren't saying, oh, let's wait for another time. This can be done later. They were resolved. They knew this was important because their city depended upon it. So they put their hands to the. Hey, just think about that for a moment. Rebuilding a wall, whether it is in your own home or in an ancient city, it would be tiring. It would take time. It would be very hard work. But it was absolutely necessary. We talked about why it was so important that the walls were their first defense against an enemy. You just imagine how overwhelming that was for Nehemiah to go from gate to gate to gate and see all of the damage and just think, there's no way we can. Maybe it would be better off for somebody else to go and do all of this, or maybe put it off for another time. I think we can get that, right? Sometimes there are things in our life where we think, there's always a better time later down the line to do something else. Or if we look hard enough, we can find something else that we could be doing instead of what needs to be done right away. Think back to that image of a tree on a house. How silly would it be if we walked through the front doors and said, we'll take care of this next year? That would be silly for us to do. Or we can say it can wait. Do we do that with our spiritual walls? Do we do that with our spiritual life? Is there a proverbial tree sticking out of our? Are there things that need to be changed that we just keep putting off? We learn anything from Nehemiah, I hope we can learn that the reconstruction, the rebuilding process is urgent. It's something that we have to get started on right away. And I want you to notice the motivation for their urgency. Look at verse 20. Nehemiah says, God of heaven. That was what motivated the people. They knew that if God was with them, they could do it. It wasn't by their own skills or abilities or talents. It was because God was with them every step of the way. And that's what encouraged them and motivated them to get started right. So make rebuilding your spiritual life a priority. Then number 3, as we go about rebuilding our spiritual life, we must enlist the help of other people as we do. We must enlist the help of other people as we do that. We're not going to take the time to read chapter 3. And as we look at this chapter, if you just take a glance over at it, you would say, this is just a list of a bunch of names. There is no way I know. But it is more, much more. It is the help that Nehemiah had to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I think Nehemiah knew, as a leader, he needed people, but even more so that this would be a task that was way too difficult for him to do alone. The text tells us in chapter 6 and verse 15, they built the wall in 52 days. There was no way Nehemiah could do that all on his own. That was not possible. But as they joined in unison together, they completed the wall because they had one another to help each other to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. If you look through this chapter, what we find is that Nehemiah gathered people from all different walks of life. First verse, we find out the very first people to volunteer for this job was the priest. And I like that because God's leaders get involved first, and then it helps other people get involved as well. But Nehemiah called people from all different kinds of vocations to join the work. He gathered goldsmiths, perfume makers, rulers, and merchants, 34 groups together to work on the wall. There's a simple word that occurs over and over and over in this chapter that is so simple and yet so profound. It is the word next. Next. So you just get this idea in your mind that here you are. I want you to imagine for a moment that you were living in Nehemiah's day. I want you to imagine that you were one of the builders of the wall. Maybe you were assigned to the fish. I want you to imagine that you are working on your part of the wall, doing all this stuff. Look next to you. You see Bessie. And all these people next to you, what do you think that would have done for them? It would have meant that there was a source of community. They were not in this alone. What seemed like an overwhelming task made easy because there were others right next working and help from whole families got involved. And all of that meant that they put the wall together in 50. Folks, we need help from others as we rebuild our spiritual. If we try to do it alone, we're just going to get disheartened and discouraged so easily. And that is why one of the blessings of being a part of a local have help from. We don't have to do it. We have people from all walks of life who can help inspire us and encourage us to keep going and keep rebuilding our spiritual life. It's an interesting thing that happens in chapter 4, where the people are rebuilding the wall, but they're separated from one another. And the text tells us that when an enemy came to invade the city as they were rebuilding, they would sound a trumpet and rally to the trumpet to help fight for one another. I will tell you, I have often thought about our gathering together on Sundays and Wednesdays as a rallying point. A place where the trumpet is sounded, where God's people are gathered together. And I can see you face to face. Reminded I'm not in this. I have brothers and sisters who are helping me rebuild the walls of my spiritual life. Because when I'm in the world and I get bombarded day by day, and my walls begin to crumble, this is my rallying. This is the point where I'm reminded I have brothers and sisters I can live next to, building their own. I need to remember. But sometimes on Wednesday nights, I don't know if you feel this way, or even Sunday morning. We may pull into the parking lot and we're just tired. Been up all night with the child. You worked all day. And there's that thought in the back of your mind, well, it would just be easier for me to stay home. But you get here, you pull in the parking lot, and you see Bob walk in the door. Big Ron. People who you know have been dealing with. Maybe you see the Crater family, the Wrights or the Rylands who are mourning the loss. That just absolutely. Or you walk in the door and you see all these wonderful little children so excited to go to Bible class and learn. Maybe you see brothers and sisters. All of a sudden, there are others who are. It is encourage each other. Hebrews 10, chapter 23 through 25, the Hebrew writer says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day. Encourage each other as we see the day drawing." And then finally, number 4, don't give up. Please don't give up. It is so easy to, but don't give up when life gets tough. We see that with the people here in Nehemiah's day as they're rebuilding the walls, that they are so tempted to give up. Nehemiah chapter 2. I'm sorry, we'll go back here in just a moment. But I want you to see, as they begin the rebuilding process after chapter 3, they immediately start facing opposition and obstacles, which is the way that it goes sometimes, right? You start something in your life, and immediately oppositions and obstacles come up. And that comes in the form of 3 men for the people of Israel: Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And they are doing everything that they can to discourage and dishearten God's people rebuilding the wall. See that, chapter 4, read verses 1 through 9. Chapter 4. It says, "Now it came about that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became furious and very angry and mocked the Jews. He spoke in the presence of his brothers and the wealthy men of Samaria and said, 'What are these people Jews doing? Are they going to restore it for them? They offer sacrifices? Can they finish in a day? Can they revive the stones from the dusty rubble, even the burned one?' Now Tobiah the Ammonite was near him, and he said, 'Even what they are building, if a fox should jump on it, he would break their stone wall down.' Discourage. Hear, O our God, how we are despised. Return the reproach upon their own heads. Give them up for plunder in a land of captivity. Do not forgive the iniquity, and let their sin be blotted out before you, for they have demoralized the builders.' So we built the wall, and the whole wall was joined together to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. Now when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the repair of the walls of Jerusalem went on, and the breaches began to be closed, very angry. All of them conspired together to come and fight against Jerusalem and cause a disturbance in it." Verse 9. "We prayed to our God. Because of them, we set up a guard against them day and night." Out there. So, right off the bat, they face criticism, opposition, discouragement as they're rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And I want you again to imagine that you're one of those builders. Imagine you're there working hard day and night, and these people come along and start mocking you, criticizing you, saying things like they said here. You guys think you can actually even do this? You think you can revive the stones from the rubble? Look at how bad this is. There's no way you can do this. I think that would be discouraging to you. We say this all the time: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never. That's such a lie. We know how easy it is to be destroyed or just discouraged by the words of others, what they say to us. One of them comes along and says, "Your wall is so weak, even if something small like a fox jumped on it." And all of that discouragement and criticism and mocking starts to lead to self-doubt in your mind, and you start to think, well, can we even do this? The text tells us in chapter 4 and verse 5, the words of the enemy had demoralized the builders. That word literally means to cause someone to lose confidence or hope or to despair. Verse 10 tells us, look at verse 10, it says, this is the sentiment, the mentality among the people of Israel. "Thus in Judah it was said, the strength of the burden bearers is failing. Yet there is much rubbish, and we ourselves are unable to rebuild the wall." We see what it does to them. They start to think, we can't do this. They consider giving up altogether. And I will tell you, as you work on your spiritual life, have your fair share. Sanballat and Tobiah try to discourage. It happens in the world as we live in the world. There may be people in your life who want to encourage you just to give up and stop serving God. The question becomes, what do we do about it? 2 things that Nehemiah did that I think we should keep in our minds. Number 1, as Nehemiah does from the very beginning, he prayed. Verse 4, Nehemiah offers a quick, simple prayer. "Hear, O our God, how we are." Lord, hear us. We're discouraged. We're struggling, but please help us. Verse 9, when the enemies come to cause a disturbance, Nehemiah prays he says, we prayed to our God. Nehemiah's first instinct in discouraging times was saying, Lord, please, we depend upon you. We are nothing without you. I am discouraged. I feel like giving up, but Lord, help me do this. On Thanksgiving Day, we were at Scott and Jesse's house, and I was sitting in a chair, and I was watching Aubrey hold Jackson. I happened to notice a bracelet. And it was the acronym FROG, F-R-O-G. I asked her what it meant, and she said, it means fully rely on God. I just was so impressed by that, and it made me think about what we're reading here. How often is it so easy to be so focused and consumed by our problems that we forget something as simple as fully relying? If we can just keep that in the forefront of our minds when I'm discouraged, I'm losing heart, frog, image of a frog, to fully rely on God. That is what prayer does. It helps me trust God, knowing that He's with me. He will get me through whatever I'm going through. Then, secondly, he prayed, but he also called upon God's people. Remember the God that you serve. Look at verse 14. The enemy has come. When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles and the rest. Remember the Lord. Fight for your right. Remember the Lord who is great, awesome. What Nehemiah is ultimately saying is fix your eyes on Him. Don't get consumed by what you're seeing in front of you in the flesh. Fix your eyes on the God that you serve. Remember Him. He is great and awesome. He is far greater than any enemy that you may face. So as you're discouraged, fix your eyes on Him. And that has been a problem and struggle for every generation. About Numbers chapter 14, Caleb and Joshua, the only spies who say, we can do this, God is with us. Everybody else got discouraged because of the enemy they saw right before them. I don't read the Message translation often, but the way that it translated this verse was incredible to me. It said, verse 14, do not be afraid of them. Put your minds on the Master. Great and awesome. And then fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives. And put your mind on the Master. We can only do that more than fixing our minds on. As I thought about all of that, I thought about Jesus, who faced his own discouragement, his own mocking by the enemy, fixed his eyes on fix his eyes on the Father. And the text in Hebrews 12 says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary. So don't give up. Don't lose heart when it gets difficult as you rebuild the walls of your spiritual life. Put your mind. So as we conclude this morning, I hope that wherever you are with your spiritual life, your spiritual wall, you've been given something to think about. Start the rebuilding. I hope you've been encouraged by the people of Nehemiah's day, the people of Israel, how they put their hands to the good work and rebuilt the walls in 52. But as I said earlier this morning, it is a lifelong process. It is something that we have to work on every single day. It will not be perfected. There's some things that we can do. We can take inventory. We can make rebuilding a priority. We can enlist help from our brothers and sisters. Refuse to give up when most of all, remember that without God, we are nothing. He gives us strength every single day. So what I would just ask you this morning to think about where you are with your strength. What do your walls look like? Maybe you're here and you realize you don't have a wall, per se. You haven't begun a life in service to God. And you're ready to make that decision this morning by becoming a Christian and obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ and being baptized for the remission of your sins. We would love to help you do that this morning. Maybe you're here this morning as a Christian and your walls are broken down. You're ready to enlist the help of brothers and sisters. Please let us help you do. Stand and sing the song.